Okay, so we had a go at explaining Snow's wavelength, and then a film he collaborated upon for Life Against the War, in my own words, perhaps haphazardly. Perhaps I was putting my head out of the chopping block when doing so. So, for this instance, for Back and Forth, we'll be reading out other sources rather instead. Back and Forth, also known as, that's unpronounceable, Arrows, is a 1969 structural film by Canadian director Michael Snow shot in and outside a classroom at the Madison, New Jersey campus of Fairleigh Dickinson University. The camera pans and tilts with varying frequency. The first section shows a pan across a building's exterior as a person walks into frame. A cut to a classroom interior shows a pan continuing the same movement along a fixed arc, both endpoints of which are signalled by the sound of the camera hitting a wooden stop arm. This is all from Wikipedia initially, by the way. For most of this first section, the pans occur with the same frequency. Figures appear at various points in the field of view described by the pan's arc, often on camera, at one of the pan's endpoints, but potentially also at any point in between, either on or off camera. 3/4 into this section, the pans begin to accelerate until the image blurs. The second section uses a tilt, which shows the room from floor to ceiling. Over this section's duration, the tilts gradually decelerate. A title card is shown, giving the shooting location, the names of people who appeared or were nearby, the equipment used, the names of the recording and processing facilities used, and the work's distributor. The final section superimposes previous pan and tilt sequences, some reversed or shown upside down, intercut with black and white footage. A title card appearing in the film reads, "This film was shot at Fairleigh Dickinson University, Madison, NJ in July 1968. Editing and recording were completed in January 1969 in New York. Appearing in the film are Alan Caprow, Emmett Williams, Max Neuhaus, Terry Marsala, Donna Orhe, Joyce Wieland, Louise Kamnitzer, George Murphy, Susan, A.O., Dr. Gordon, Libba Bayrak, Annie Scotty, Mary, Mac, students from the HEP program, and others. Nearby were Nancy Graves, Richard Serra, John Giorno, Paul Ide, Alison Knowles, Judd Yalcott, and many others. Film stock was Ektachrome 7257, camera, Bolex H16 with Kinotar 12.7 lens. Recording was by Darwin Studio and prints by Filmtronics, New York, available from New York Filmmakers Cooperative, 175 Lexington. Manny Farber, writing in the January 1970 issue of Art Forum, commented on the work's sculptural effects. I'm going to read out a larger version of this quote, which I found at filmmakerscoop.com, rather than what's just on Wikipedia here. This neat, finely tuned, hypersensitive film examines the outside and inside of a banal prefab classroom, stares at an asymmetrical space so undistinguished that it's hard to believe the whole movie is confined to it, and has this neck-jerking camera gimmick that hits a wooden stop arm at each end of its swing. Basically, it's a perpetual motion film that ingeniously builds a sculptural effect by insisting on time motion to the point where the camera swinging arcs in white wall field assume the hardness and the dimensions of a concrete beam. In such a hard drilling work, the wooden clap sounds are a terrific invention, and as much as any single element to create the sculpture, seeming to thrust the image outward off the screen, these clap effects are timed like a metronome, sometimes occurring with torrential frequency. And now back to Wikipedia. Gene Youngblood, in the January 2nd to 8th, 1970 edition of the Los Angeles Free Press, regarded Back and Forth as an expansion of cinema's narrative parameters. In Back and Forth, Snow was able to completely suffuse form of content while not relinquishing the traditional elements of characterization and acting. Writing in the Monthly Film Bulletin for September 1976, Jonathan Rosenbaum similarly addressed the film's use of characterization. Although a man crosses the visual field in the opening shot, and people are glimpsed at intervals throughout, their presence comprises not the subject, but the counterpoint of a physical process defined by the continual panning motion of the camera. Let's read out this section from angelsbarcelona.com. The camera continually moves back and forth, gradually speeding up until everything blurs, and the camera begins to move up and down. Snow refers to back and forth as an educational film, which is a visual demonstration of the theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. In other words, the representation of a solid body, the classroom which becomes the mass, is transformed into energy, light, by means of speed, that of the camera, which executes horizontal and then vertical pans of varying speed. I'm going to read this from Michael Snow. It's a letter from Film Culture number 47. This is a source from lux.org.uk. As a move from the implications of wavelength, back and forth attempts to transcend through the motion more than light. There will be less of a paradox and in a way less drama than in the other film. It is more concrete and more objective. Back and forth is sculptural. It's also a kind of demonstration or a lesson in perception and in concepts of law and order and their transcendence. It is in/of/depicts a classroom. I think it will be seen to present a different, possible new spectator-image relationship. My films are, to me, attempts to suggest the mind of a certain state or certain states of consciousness. They are drug relatives in that respect. Back and forth will be less comment and dream than the others. You aren't within it. It isn't you. You're beside it. Back and forth is sculptural because the depicted light is to be outside, around the solid wall, which becomes transcended/spiritualized by motion time, whereas in wavelength it is more transcended by light time. However, back and forth involves one's neck as well as one's mind eyes. I'll read out this now. Notes on Film and Restoration. This is by Kent Jones. This is from filmfoundation.org. This is posted in 2021. About 25 years ago, a writer I knew gave me a call. He was writing a piece about film restoration. He was taking a contrarian's point of view. He didn't have a problem with the actual practice of restoration and preservation per se, but with the advocacy for the practice. He had a Darwinian perspective. He maintained that the best films would always be cared for because they were the ones that had stood the test of time, while the less good ones would simply fall by the wayside and go the way of extinct species like the perennian ibex or the dodo. I listened patiently and then explained to him, as calm and in as much detail as I could, that he was out of his mind. There was the fragility of film itself, and the many ways that earlier stocks could deteriorate. There was the reality of vault fires, which had destroyed the negatives of many films that were long considered classics. There was the fact that the greatness of certain films was recognized only long after their initial releases, at which point they were deemed disappointments or failures. That list is endless, but The Night of the Hunter, which we covered a few months ago, is a perfect example. Then there's the question of changing standards. At this moment, there is a great obsession with accessibility. Is a given film too esoteric? Does it only appeal to the elitist tastes of auteurists? Such cliches are now rampant. At the highest levels on the accessibility meter would be films made within the last 10 years, officially sanctioned by the AFI or AMPAS, English language only, of course. At the very lowest levels would be avant-garde cinema, whose audiences are always small, dedicated, and tightly knit. And within the world of the avant-garde, the early work of the great Canadian musician, visual artist, and filmmaker Michael Snow would surely register near zero. If one were to follow my old acquaintance's test of restoration worthiness, the negative for Snow's 1969 film Back and Forth would be wedged into the bottom of the stack, at the darkest corner of a mildewed cellar. This is the worst kind of art film, begins the synopsis on the director's Fortnight website, probably written by the filmmaker. Back and Forth takes place almost entirely in an empty classroom. Various people show up now and then. The gimmick here is that the camera continuously moves back and forth at an ever-increasing rate of speed, and by the end of the picture, everything's just a blur. In a 2007 interview, Snow fondly recalled a 1969 MoMA screening, Museum of Modern Art screening. 10 minutes into it, a guy jumped up and said, "This is basically a piece of shit. I want this stopped." And another guy said, "Shut up. We want to watch this." They were facing each other and they started to fight. There were 20 or so people in the audience, all of whom got up and left once they started fighting. Back and Forth, which is restored by Anthology Film Archives with the assistance of the Film Foundation, Anthology is now at work on Snow's earlier wavelength, brings to mind Snow's frequently quoted 1967 statement, "My paintings are done by a filmmaker, sculpture by a musician, films by a painter, music by a filmmaker, paintings by a sculptor, sculpture by a filmmaker, films by a musician, music by a sculptor. Sometimes they all work together." A flat screen, kinetic sculpture, a plunge into the heart of perception itself, a transformation from the absolutely mundane into the uncanny right before our eyes. As a student, I remember the amazement of watching this film for the first time on a KEM, Was I going to run out and rave about it to all my friends who weren't into movies? No. Was I going to call my parents and tell them to see it, if they only could, and take all their friends? Nope. Did I have an issue with the commercial film industry for marginalising Snow's work? No. Two separate worlds. Was it accessible? Well, it was accessible to me, an audience of one, and if I reject the term elitist as a means of describing my solitary experience, that's because I've come to see that it's always a matter of one person at a time with all the arts. Even a mass art form like the cinema, it's great to experience anything in a crowded theatre, but in the end it's always just the movie and you. And a couple of more now. This is from 2020, Declan Cochrane. Michael Snow's 1968 film Back and Forth makes a chiral, C-H-I-R-A-L, I don't know that one, out of, we're just going to look up the definition of that for AUD's sake. Chirality. Chemistry term. An object or a system is a chiral if it is distinguishable from its mirror image, that is, it cannot be superposed, not to be confused with superimposed, onto it. Conversely, a mirror image of a chiral object, such as a sphere, cannot be distinguished from the object. Okay. It makes a chiral out of limitation and potential, proving with deftness and rigour that the two seemingly disparate concepts can work as one and the same when the conditions are right. The form of his film is simple. The camera moves, fixed back and forth, panning a rundown and dimly lit classroom. When it hits the edge of what is presumably a block, there is a tap or knock and then the camera moves the other way. This is the film over and over again, in various permutations for 50 minutes. The speed at which the camera moves varies, sometimes moving so fast that it becomes a blur, sometimes so slowly that it is minimal. There are large swathes of the film where nothing is happening other than this movement, and even when something is happening, it is not in clearly defined narrative terms, more like arrangements within the frame, such as a large gathering of people, or someone in the doorway or window. It is a highly conceptual piece, and indeed Snow works under the umbrella of structural cinema. This was a name coined by P. Adams Sidney in relation to a loosely connected group of avant-garde film artists who worked within a post-Brechtian reduction of the moving image to its most composite elements in an attempt to force the viewer to question their most basic notions of cinematic perception. As Snow sketches his film, it operates like the inverse of Brackage's process. If Brackage, who was not part of structural cinema, sought to dismantle the logic of human vision by rendering cinematic images from the outside as disparate, abstract compositions constantly shifting and evolving, then Snow works within restricted forms of those images to indicate their haptic potential if handled in the correct manner. Snow's method also resembles a filmic equivalent of Boulet's structures, which used integral serialism to explore possibilities for new sounds distinct from more traditional compositional technique. Indeed, if Brackage and Snow are aesthetic opposites, then Snow attempts roughly a Brackagian image in the climax of this film, and it's notable how much remains legible, even as the image falls apart in front of us. As the camera continues to move back and forth, the viewer cannot help but be drawn in. My assumption that there were two main fields of vision gave way to the realization that there are four, the camera view from the left and the camera view from the right, but then the view from right to left and left to right, each having distinct visual perspectives and capturing particular specificities of motion. Indeed, it seems to recall Boulet's wish to find a perfectly new synthesis, one not corrupted from the very outset by foreign bodies. The way the camera pans, as opposed to tracking or dollying, indicates a swinging motion not dissimilar to digging, and the repetitious rhythm feels a little bit like something is being carved, a new visual revelation with each movement. One morbid reading could be of the camera and cinematography as a pendulum swinging closer and closer to a destination that is perhaps out of reach. Any morbidity could be corroborated by the fact that the film does, in some way, function as a horror film. It certainly articulates in a primitive form a number of techniques which would go on to become horror shorthand in the genre's 70s heyday. The constantly shifting frame from such a rigid and fixed position traps the viewer as if you can look left and right but not move your head. Whilst this sensation does abate, there are moments when a figure will suddenly appear in the hallway or window and disrupt the field of vision in an upsetting way. Whilst these figures are not in themselves scary, as horror, proper images they would be crude and unsophisticated, the horror comes in the discrepancy between how Snow attunes the viewer so acutely to the frame's tightly controlled minutiae, and the seemingly random way in which he inserts various elements. This, coupled with the sense of being trapped, is perhaps a distillation of the horror mechanism to its most basic form. When it is not scary, it is fascinating. In one spellbinding instance, a woman walks slowly across the room while the camera pans seem to divide the woman into different liminal captured spaces. First she is on the right of the room, then the camera moves left, then back to right, and she is gone. The camera moves left again, and she is there. The camera moves right, and then left, and she has left through the door. In its way, this sequence tells you all you could ever wish to know about how the movie camera delineates space through visual editing, assigning value to arbitrary portions contained within its field of view, within an unbroken shot no less, that are tactile, interactive. Whilst the work sounds repetitious, as if it has repetition baked into its DNA, Snow seems to undermine the concept of repetition within this work. If repetition, as typically defined, is seeing the same thing over and over again, then Snow does not fit that definition. It initially seems to operate as a cinematic epanalepsis, repeating the clauses within Snow's one cinematic sentence by returning to them with each swing of the pendulum camera. Epanalepsis is a figure of speech in which the beginning of a clause or sentence is repeated at the end of that same clause or sentence with words intervening. The sentence, "The king is dead, long live the king," is an example of epanalepsis. Cool. Snow injects too much variation via speed and mise-en-scene for us to consider the images being truly replicated. As the work continues, Snow's images and allusions take on the quality of layers or of butter pressed between pastry, being folded and rolled, one layer becoming 2, and then 4, and so on. Erin Manning has written in her work Relationscapes that stability is vision's illusion. What we take to be stillness is actually an appearance of the composed relation across moments. There is no such thing as stillness, only an illusion which we take for granted. In the same manner, Snow creates a composed relation which, whilst having the form of one thing, a fixed series of shots, slowly reveals itself as multitudinous and aesthetically dense. Multitudinous, which just means very numerous, vast. In probing so deeply into his own self-composed vision's illusions, Snow's effect calls into question the very nature of cinema, of images, of watching. It is a deeply vital work that anyone even halfway interested in cinema as art should immerse themselves in. To have created so much from so little is a form of wizardry.